So I think our book does a nice job of talking about the American moment of 1837, very close, by the way, to when Hawthorne writes "My kinsman Major Molyneux." That this speech fits into it. It's an examination of intellectual and cultural independence. And more than that, it's an exploration of the relationship between the individual and society, in which Emerson is very anxious about the power of society to impinge upon the holistic development of the individual self and the creative independent thinking of the individual self. So that's the larger context for the American scholar and the larger argument that's going on. But what I'd like to do is supplement what you've read already in the introduction with my own discussion of what I think are some of Emerson's key style moves. One of them is what we would call aphorism or aphoristic sentences. An aphorism, a way to think about that is like a tweet. A tweet is an aphorism. It's a short, concise sentence designed to offer some big insight, right? And because of that, aphorisms are also often problematic, right? You take a huge, complicated idea and you try to capture it in some, like a jingle, right? In a very compressed manner. Emerson's a master of this. He invokes these aphorisms quite a bit. You can almost think of them as 19th century bumper stickers. And there's a classic one right in one of the early paragraphs of American Scholar where he says, "Man is not a farmer or a professor or an engineer, but he is all." Now, this is a big idea compressed into one ear-catching sentence. And I want to emphasize the idea of ear-catching. We have to remember that most people heard Emerson's essays first in an oral form. They were speeches, they were talks given either at events or at groups of people who had gathered and even paid to listen to Emerson deliver a speech. So these aphoristic sentences are very powerful tools in a speaking environment. You throw out the aphorism and then you use the rest of your language to kind of support that idea. But the aphorism catches the listener's attention, gives the listener a hook to hang their thinking on as you unpack more, as you dig in, and we'll show the tools Emerson uses to dig in. But the aphoristic sentence is often the attention getter. It's often a main claim for Emerson, or it's often a dramatic statement of a premise that sets up his main claim. So you want to keep an eye out for Emerson's aphoristic sentences. But once he throws out an aphorism, one of Emerson's favorite next move is to play with a metaphor. And often that metaphor is set up with really powerful images. And we know what metaphors are already. We've talked about how poets and writers use comparisons between usually dissimilar things to take the vehicle as a tool to help a reader understand a tenor. And in this case, we've got this awesome sentence about what society does to us as individuals, right? So the state of society is one in which the members have suffered amputation from the trunk. So we've got this metaphor of amputation, right? Where the vehicle is amputation, the trunk is a vehicle to represent society, and then all the pieces that strut around are individuals. So we have this vivid image of fingers and necks and stomachs, but not whole people wandering around. And it's an image of, I think it's an image of breakdown and alienation of the human individual from the larger society, but more importantly, an alienation of the human individual from that person's whole self. Right? You are just your finger, you're just your stomach, you're just your elbow, you're not a full person. And these are all these words are metaphors for the different labels that people are reduced to, particularly labels about work in American culture. And so this really powerful metaphor and this really vivid imagery, that phrase walking monsters, is amazing, right? The individual, instead of being sort of empowered by this society, is reduced to a walking monster. These kind of resonant metaphors are such a powerful tool for Emerson because his logical sensibility is often more poetic than argumentative, more poetic than legalistic, more poetic than philosophical. He is trying to provoke us to really question our relationship with society. And he uses a metaphor coupled with powerful imagery to do that. So aphorism, metaphor paired with imagery. And then another cool variation on this is metonymy. And if metaphor is built around comparison, metonymy is built around contiguity or proximity or association. So when we talk metonym, the classic is you replace one thing with a word or thing that's closely related to it. So instead of saying the presidency, we say the White House. We don't really necessarily mean the literal White House. We mean the work of the presidency and the office of the presidency that happens in that building. So that's a classic example of metonym. And Emerson, in many ways, structures this piece, American Scholar, around a metonym or a series of metonyms. And he lays them out right here in paragraph 5, where he takes these different professions, right, and transforms them metonomically into an object associated with them. So they're further reduced, right? These metonyms are reductive because they take what should be a whole person. That person then becomes a priest, and that priest then just becomes a form. By form, I think Emerson means a religious procedure or ritual, not a paper form that we fill out. Attorney becomes a statute book. A mechanic, a machine. So instead of a larger whole human being, we become reduced to metonymic representations of the work we're doing. And it's interesting, too, the choices here. Religion. Emerson's real worried about formal religion and its impact in American culture. The law through the attorney. He's worried about legal systems and their power to conform and hinder and limit human freedom. The mechanic, he's worried about growing industrialization in America. He's excited about it too, but he's worried about it. And then the ship, which is a central image of travel and commerce in 19th century America. So the metonyms are not accidental. They are very carefully chosen as a way for Emerson to talk about the multiple threats he sees to our holistic humanity. At the same time, by using a metonym to make his point about how we as individuals become reduced not only to the work we do, but to the objects associated with that work. So it's a great example of metonymy and how it can work in literature. But the biggest thing we want to talk about with Emerson is what I like to call a dialectic or a binary, where Emerson sets up a pair of ideas in opposition to each other. And sometimes the pairing is false. Sometimes the pairing is something he just creates. But it allows him, by unpacking that pairing, by deconstructing that pairing, by undercutting or recasting that pairing, it allows Emerson to make a larger point. And so a really good example of, see a little typo in there, a really good example of this early on is the planter, there's a lot of phrases in between, sinks into the farmer instead of man on the farm. So this is a running idea in the essay, right? The farmer versus the man on the farm. The thinker versus man thinking. The lawyer versus man studying law. It's an interesting differentiation he's making here. But the fundamental tension is if we allow ourselves to become a subset of ourselves and allow society to define us as that, we've lost the larger self that is supposed to be in play here, the transcendent self, the self that's in touch with the larger truths that for Emerson are universal, even though he's going to argue we have to find them by exploring our individual selves and stepping away from society. He's not a relativist. He ultimately believes there are universal truths. The question is, how do we get there? And for Emerson, society is sort of an obstacle to discovering those universal truths. He wants us to move into ourselves and explore ourselves and express our creative selves. And part of what he's concerned about is when we're made the student instead of person as student, we become trapped, right? We become trapped in frames that limit our freedom and limit our capacity to discover the great truths, which Emerson actually believes lie within. That universal oversoul, the pathway to it is through the self, not through society. You don't have to buy that. I just want you to understand where Emerson is coming from. So I'd like to encourage you to keep an eye out for these moves: the aphorism, the metaphor, the metonym, the dialect or binary. Let's end with one last slide that gets at sort of the key idea of the scholar, which is another example of this binary. It's man thinking versus a mere thinker. And that's sort of it. And what Emerson's worried about is if we become a mere thinker, we're vulnerable to just parroting what other people think rather than touching the genius within ourselves and finding that genius within ourselves and then bringing it out to the world. We're going to talk more about this when we get to self-reliance later in the week, the second Emerson essay we're going to read. But I hope you'll spend the time to really explore American Scholar. I'm going to ask you in the discussion to take one of these techniques that I've shown you and find another example of it in the essay and explore how Emerson uses that technique to generate meaning, to support his argument. And again, there they are, the big four: dialect or binary, metonymy, metaphor, aphoristic sentences. There's a ton of else going on. You'll see a million different things. But those are four I really want you to watch for. All right, folks, see you in Canvas. Look forward to seeing what you have to say about Emerson.